opinion, but I want to put you on the spot on the current situation. And that is related primarily to the role of the military. I mean, I was talking about the choices that we faced when you were in the White House, you know, advocating democracy, having to stick to strategic relations that are essential. When you look at what's happening now, you know, obviously the Muslim Brotherhood did very well. The Salafis did well in the parliamentary elections. We don't know who's going to be the next president of Egypt, but I would submit to you that it's probably going to be the candidate that is going to be backed by the Muslim Brotherhood, even if it's not going to be one of them. So those are uncomfortable things for Americans to hear, even if they're elected democratically. On the other hand, you have the military, which is seeming to want to exert itself and maintain power. When you look at what they're doing, A, they're essential because we cooperate with them on strategic issues day by day. B, you see what happened just yesterday in brokering a ceasefire between the Palestinians and the Israelis, something that could have gotten out of control. We couldn't do that, they did it. They're providing the service. It's really mostly the military institution that has that close relationship. That's tough. Those are tough choices for America to do. On the one hand, embrace the existing institutions that we're comfortable working with. On the other hand, let go and allowing results that we don't like to take place. I mean, how do we deal with this?
Well, but part of that is the patience and space that Zbig and Mrs. Sadat talked about. I mean, I think, you know, there's a lot of apprehension about what's happening in places like Egypt. But as Mrs. Sadat was saying when we were talking before, there's some very positive things. Look, other than the first days of this revolution where, unfortunately, some real courageous people died, largely at the hands of the military, this has been a largely peaceful revolution. Secondly, they did conduct a free and fair election for the parliament, the first really free and fair election probably in millennia in that country. That's an important thing to say. Yes, the Muslim Brotherhood won more votes than any other party. Is that a surprise? Since President Mubarak had this very short-sighted policy of consciously oppressing any centrist democratic secular parties. He made war on them all and created a situation where it was either the Mubarak party or it was the Brotherhood, which was the only vehicle for expressing dissent. And so it is not a surprise that they, in some sense, emerge as the champion of the revolution, even though the revolution was made by a lot of these younger men and women in the streets. So there is, I think, a lot to be said for this revolution, for what it has done. I think we have to understand that if because a party has Muslim or Islamist in its name, you're not going to deal with it, then we are going to take ourselves out of the game in most of these Middle Eastern countries. And the issue is, can we work with these parties, and can we encourage them to be, which I think is the most important thing, which is, can we encourage them to be pluralistic and inclusive parties that are committed over the long term to democracy? And I think that's the challenge. Marwan Muasher, who a number of you know, and who you and Zbigniew know, was a former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Jordan, and I was on a panel with him about 3 weeks ago, and he said something very interesting. He said the challenge in the Middle East is that neither in political Islam or in Arab nationalism was there a tradition of pluralism. And that's really what's missing, and that's really what needs to be built. Cross-sectarian pluralism and inclusiveness. And that's really what we need to try to help the countries as they make these revolutions, or make these transitions, which is the word I would like to use. We need to try to help them find a way to pluralism and inclusiveness, because that is the way you can be stable over the long term.
Well, as you reminded us, with all the challenges, Egypt has relatively gone well in the sense that it has not been as violent as many of the others, and they've had an election, and it's only been a year. So I think we have to wait and see. But let me move to a country where there is a lot of violence, and I'll start with you, Dr. Brzezinski, on Syria. And that's because, I mean, I know that when you look at the Arab awakening, particularly first starting in Tunis, then going to Egypt. They were relatively peaceful, went relatively well. They inspired a lot of people, including Americans. In fact, public opinion poll I did here in the US found that the Americans, for the first time, majorities, had positive view of the Arab people. Tahrir Square sort of painted a positive picture of, that was, you can call it the post 9/11, getting over the 9/11 paradigm. And now we're going into a phase in some countries where there is a lot of violence. In Syria, clearly, a very bloody place, very tragic, and yet it is very hard to know what to do for American foreign policy. We have not been able to get the Security Council to act collectively. There's death and killing every day, and we don't seem to know what to do. I know that you supported reluctantly, I would say, the intervention in Libya.
No, I supported it fully.
Fully.
From the very beginning.
From the beginning. And as did I. And I wonder, why is Syria different from Libya?
Because Syria is not Libya. It's as basic as that. And Assad is not Gaddafi. And there are other differences as well. For example, there was significant military and political opposition at a high level to Gaddafi in Libya, which surfaced immediately when the unrest erupted into violence. The Gaddafi regime was not a fully institutionalized regime. It was a highly personalized regime in which special arrangements with particular tribes also contributed to political stability. And once these special arrangements began to break down, the whole thing started breaking down. It was also more easily accessible to external force because essentially the real sort of center of life in Libya is close to the shores. So naval forces and air forces could be very decisive. All of these differences, I think, underline the greater complexity of the Syrian problem and the limitations of what can be done from the outside, and particularly by really out of the region parties. I do not favor, to be perfectly blunt, an American military initiative vis-à-vis Syria. I don't think that right now it is very clear as to how that could unfold. The notion of undertaking airstrikes against a regime which is really not dependent on air power for the exercise of its authority as well as violence against society is not going to be very effective. And there is a real risk that if America became more directly involved, the conflict could assume increasingly anti-American characteristics, not only in terms of Syrian resistance to it, but even more generally in terms of Islamic perception of America. We have been involved in a war with Iraq, not such a long time ago, and I was against that war. We have had to be involved in Afghanistan, but we have been involved for too long and with overly ambitious objectives, with consequences which we're beginning to see now surfacing. And I would not want to add to that list yet another conflict in which America plays the preeminent role and relies on the military for its solution. Because in the general context of what I perceive as a decline in American influence in the Middle East, that would further aggravate the trend. So what do I favor? I favor something that you may view as an evasion of responsibility, but I don't think it's an evasion of responsibility. It is taking a stand, but a stand which more realistically addresses the problematics of the region. That is to say, Syria is bordered by two countries, one directly, one somewhat indirectly, Turkey and Saudi Arabia. These are important countries. They have resources, economic and financial. They have military resources, and particularly so the Turks, less the Saudis. I would favor taking a very clear position with the Turks and the Saudis that if they decide on a course of action that they think is needed for resolving the Syrian problem, and particularly if the Arab community more generally supports it, we'll support it fully. And in that context, act a little bit the way we acted in Libya. That is to say, support from the back. If they decide to let the issue fester And that's a cruel decision, but I can imagine circumstances in which maybe they will. Then I think, unfortunately, we don't have much choice. The conflict within Syria is still sporadic. It is not a comprehensive conflict. It is not a conflict which has visible, united leadership and a clear platform. So I think at this stage, America plunging ahead with military action by air or with some other notion of how to resolve this problem by force, I think would be counterproductive, premature, and probably even regionally, perhaps destabilizing.
Your thoughts?
I think I agree with Spig on the description of the problem, the analysis problem. I think I'd emphasize a couple other factors that lead me to maybe a little different prescription. The narrative you want out of this and that the Syrian people want is that the Syrian people threw off a dictator and freed themselves. The narrative that you don't want, if you can avoid it, is the Western powers came in and overthrew another Arab leader. That's not the right narrative. Secondly, Peter Ackerman, who's done a lot of work on civil resistance, one of the problems is the longer this goes, the more militarized it becomes, the less likely it is to get a democratic outcome, because the future will be dictated not by who has the most votes, but who has the most guns. Third, I worry that the sectarianism that is beginning to show itself in the Syrian conflict. And my worry about sort of championing a Turkish-Saudi intervention is that this quickly becomes Sunnis versus Shia, and almost a proxy war between Saudis and Iran in Syria. And I don't think that bodes well for what we need in Syria, which is a democratic outcome in which all groups can view themselves as part of a new Syria. But the dilemmas are very difficult. I think what I've talked about really doing is two things. One, we have got to help the Syrian National Council, as weak and divided as it is. We have got to help the opposition form into a unified political group that can send a message to all elements of Syrian society that there is a part of them, there is a role for them in a post-Assad Syria. Why do I say that? Because the only reason Assad is still there is because the military still supports him, the Sunni business class still supports him, and the minority groups, of which the Alawites are one, but Christians and Kurds and others, are worried about what life will be like under a Sunni-led government. And so what has to happen is these groups need to be broken away, and they need to be convinced to turn their back on Assad. So there's a lot of political work that is done here, and if we need to go for more coercive measures, my instinct is to say, try to arm. These are people, you know, the courage of the Syrian people. They've kept this up for over 11 months. They go out and demonstrate on Fridays, leaving the mosque, knowing that on any Friday, several dozen of them will be killed. I mean, this is enormous courage. And the moral claim to arm them, I think, is becoming strong. But we've got to arm it in a smart way that does not encourage sectarianism and can hopefully build a political base for a cross-sectarian solution. But it is very, very difficult. And
well, let me ask you a question here.
Yep.
How do you arm them? They're all in Turkey. And you can't do it without the Turks. And the Turks are not going to be pliant tools of American policy. So the only way we can do it is if the Turks are prepared to take the lead, better still with the Saudis who could at least pay for some of it. I think that's the way then perhaps to respond.
I agree with that. And I think Turkey is key, and they're not, I think they need to be our partner on this issue.
And they cannot be alone.
And it's been very interesting. Turkey's role over the last 6 months has changed dramatically. They are, after all, allowing thousands of refugees and this Syrian Free Syrian Army to be in their territory. So I think that's exactly right. I think Spig is absolutely right. It has to be a regional approach. We need to be talking not only to the Saudis, but to the Turks, but also, for example, to the Iraqis, who have a real interest in how this comes out, and that it does not become a sectarian struggle in Syria, because that risks opening up sectarian struggle in Iraq. So we need to do this in conjunction with the neighbors and in a smart way, with an all agreement that this is not going to be Sunni versus Shia. This is going to be helping the Syrian people, all the Syrian people, try to throw off a tyrant and establish a different kind of Syria. But it's hard.
May I, before we rush into this emerging consensus here, may I just ask a question about Russia? Because I think we're talking about regional. Clearly, one of the big failures was to get the inability to get a Security Council resolution on Syria. Russia has played a very important role in supporting the Assad regime. In Libya, we had a UN resolution. The Russians, they came in reluctantly on that, at least understanding it to be different. And I'm just wondering whether arming may not lead to arming of the other side. We've talked about Iran arming Syria, but what about Russia? And have we in some ways mismanaged the relationship with Russia on Syria? Is Russia, they seem to be now working directly with the Arab League. They've just reached some agreement with Arab states. Is there room for us to work with Russia on Syria?
Well, you raised an interesting point in the context of your question, namely, might the Russians then decide to start arming the other side, helping Assad? My guess is that they will only do so if their judgment was that in a real showdown based on force, Assad will prevail. Then they'll make the decision to support him. If they're not sure that he will, or think that he will lose, they won't. I don't know what their judgment is. But my guess is, from what they're observing, they're not convinced yet that he will lose. And that raises a further question, namely, it's not only the Russians. The Chinese are supporting them. We have to be very careful not to manage or mismanage this issue by thrusting ourselves too far ahead, to create, in effect, an opposition to us which not only proves surprisingly effective within Syria, but becomes part of a larger contest in which all of a sudden we have the Chinese and the Russians on the same side. That's certainly not in our interest. That would be a major reversal of the changes of the last 2 decades, 3 decades.
I'm not foolish enough to talk Russia policy with Zbigniew Brzezinski. I will say this. I think he's right about Russia and their calculus. I think also now that Putin has won his election, in quotes, I think there may be more freedom and more scope on Syria policy. And secondly, why we should work with Russia and China and the UN, we should not be bound by the UN. The things Spig and I are talking about with Turkey and Iraq and Saudi, you can do without a UN resolution, and we should. And if we do, and have a policy that is showing some success, so that Assad looks like he's not going to win, I think the Russians will come along. And once the Russians come along, I think the Chinese will come along, because on this issue, I don't think the Chinese want to be isolated. So I think we can accommodate it in the way that we've talked about.
I'm going to move to the Iran issue. Obviously, it's a hot issue of the day, and I'm going to ask you a number of questions on it. But I just one last question about Syria, not because of Syria, but because I think everybody, the American public, the international public, the Arab public, is much more moved by the humanitarian disasters than we have seen in the past, and it may be a function of the information revolution. Assad did a lot of killing back in 1982, and it was not we only knew about the scope of it afterwards, and it certainly wasn't the burning issue of the day at that time. Now we have an information revolution, which is not only leading to everybody knowing almost instantly, but to certain kind of expectations, almost moral expectations on across the board, and it's not even national, on scale that we had not seen before. And I wonder, especially, we call this the information revolution, the Arab awakening is a function of the information revolution to a large extent, whether in fact the information revolution is also creating expectations of different international behavior, and that the institutions of international politics have not really changed enough to accommodate them, that this is not that the choices that we have are more painful than usual. Maybe that's just an imaginary, picture that I'm painting. You both have had many episodes in the past in which there were tough choices, but is there a sense that there is this gap between public expectations globally and the failure of international institutions to deal with them? I mean, the UN, obviously, but also national.
It's very interesting. Some of you probably saw it. There was a video, about 20, 25 minutes, that was put out on Facebook about a week ago about this guy Coney and the Lord's Resistance Army, which is a truly gruesome group that is operating in the Congo and in the Uganda area with child soldiers and all the rest. And it had like millions of hits in the first few hours. And it's a capacity to bring the intention of the world and governments to humanitarian crises is enormous. And that will prod government action. It will make Dr. Brzezinski's job as a national security advisor a lot harder. And it will, because these are difficult to respond to. But on balance, I think it's positive. I think you've also seen that the social media is enormously empowering, is enormously democratic in the sense that people can network and organize and have a voice. And it can bring down authoritarian structures. But it then becomes a tool for, in some sense, democratization, bringing down authoritarian structures. What we saw in Egypt, though, is the tool by itself is not sufficient to organize people in ways that can systematically replace those structures that have been brought down. And that's, in some sense, both the promise of the social media, but the limitation of the social media. In the end of the day, in terms of the parliamentary election, it was about organization. And that's what the Muslim Brotherhood had, and that's what the kids who made the revolution in Tahrir Square do not yet have. Hopefully they will have, but do not yet have.
I'm going to move to the Iran issue, and obviously, there is talk of war in the air, and a lot of people are worried. Some see even similarities with the lead up to the Iraq war. We had just a little over a week ago, President Obama met with Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, who seems to be alluding to the fact that Israel is contemplating a unilateral strike on Iran's nuclear facilities that they think would set its program back. The U.S. has made it clear that it doesn't really want to see that happen, that the U.S. believes diplomacy must be given a chance. And I want to ask you questions about that, but I want to report to you a poll that we just released simultaneous with this event. Many of you may have found this on your chairs, some of the press releases. This is a poll that I conducted with my colleague Stephen Cull and the Program on International Policy Attitudes. We just released it here in the U.S., which is about American attitudes toward the Iran nuclear issue, but also the prospect of Israel striking Iran. 2 weeks ago, we released a poll from Israel itself, where we found only 19% of Israelis supported an Israeli strike on Iran without American support. And most of them were pessimistic about the consequences. That poll has been confirmed by another poll since that was just released a few days ago in Israel. In this poll, interestingly, American public opinion seems to be similar to Israeli public opinion, whereas we have only one quarter of the U.S., 24% of the American public supports an Israeli strike on Iran, and 7 out of 10 Americans want the U.S. to give diplomacy more of a chance. When you ask them what should the U.S. do if Israel does strike Iran anyway, only about a quarter say the U.S. should intervene militarily. Most Americans don't want to see the U.S. Intervene militarily. Half want the U.S. to remain neutral on this issue. When you ask them about the prospects of what might happen if, in fact, Iran is struck militarily, they believe that it wouldn't delay them by more than 1 to 5 years. And they believe that only a minority believe it would actually hurt the government. And they believe that the conflict will last months or years, not days or weeks. So, which, by the way, is almost parallel to the findings we had in Israel. So they're pessimistic about the consequences. 9 out of 10 Americans think that Iran actually will ultimately end up with nuclear weapons. And a puzzle in all of this is that 62% of Americans think if Iran actually acquires nuclear weapons, it will use them against Israel. Which is, very paradoxical in some ways, given all of the findings that we had. So clearly, if Israel strikes Iran, it is consequential not only for Israel, but for the U.S. Can the U.S. avoid being drawn in? Regardless, by the way, while the American public doesn't want the U.S. to intervene if Israel strikes Iran, a slight majority thinks that the U.S. will intervene anyway, will support, at least diplomatically, will actually support. So there is a difference between what they prescribe and what they expect American behavior to actually be, at least diplomatically. So how much leverage do we have, first of all, on Israel in terms of persuading it or dissuading it from attacking Iran? And what are our options here, Dr. Brzezinski?
Well, we have tremendous influence, potentially, on Israel. The question is whether we are prepared to apply it. Let's be realistic here. Israel is a good friend of the United States. We have, and I think legitimately so, a moral obligation towards Israel in view of what transpired during World War II. And that is, I think, a true moral imperative, and we cannot dismiss that. But at the same time, it is also a fact that we are the principal source